Let's talk manure. So I'm Justin with Veteran Compost, and today we're talking about horse manure. Using it in your garden, using it in your compost pile, some of the do's, some of the don'ts, the pros, the cons, the things to watch out for. So give us a couple minutes, let's talk about the good stuff, the bad stuff, and the things to beware of. When it comes to horse manure, we have some horse manure compost here. This was screened to a 1/2 inch. It's pretty well finished and aged. A little bit of a lighter brown color. The first things first, horse manure can be a great compost and a great material. So that's the good news, but there's some things we need to know about it. Number one, do not ever use raw horse manure in your garden. A couple reasons for that. Number one, there can be a little bit hot, literally temperature-wise and in terms of nutrients, and it can burn your plants. There's also kind of some concerns with raw manure about pathogens. That's why if you look up food safety and the rules that exist for commercial farmers, there are rules that exist on timing of raw manure to production of crops. So I would never put raw manure in my vegetable garden or anything I'm going to eat, because I don't want those things coming in contact with each other. And then finally, I do have some concerns about raw manure and herbicides. So one of the downsides that we'll talk about is herbicides can be in this material. If you're buying horse manure compost, hey, that can be pretty good for your garden, but a couple things to think about. Number one, a lot of folks are offering it for free or very cheaply on Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, wherever. The first thing you want to ask is, what's your compost method? Because a lot of people just put it in a big pile, and then they let it sit, and they call it aged manure. And that is not compost, that's just an old pile of manure. And the problem with that is that it hasn't been through a composting process of high temperatures that's going to reduce pathogens, reduce weed seeds, and create a stable product for your garden. So when you ask them what's your compost method, and they shrug or say, well, we put it in that big pile, find somewhere else to buy your compost. That's not a product you want. Because what happens when horses eat weeds that they find, thistle and things like that growing in a field, their digestive system is not going to destroy a weed seed. So if a horse eats weeds, it's going to poop them out. And then those weed seeds are in the manure. And if you don't get really hot temperatures, 131 degrees Fahrenheit or more, to break down those weed seeds will then be in that material. And as you spread it all over your garden, you now have a garden full of weeds. So everybody who's taken horse manure that's well aged probably has a story about why they regret that. So we want to make sure it gets composted because of those weed seeds. And then finally, you want to ask them, well, what do you feed the horses? Should I be worried about herbicides? And if they don't have a very good answer, I would also go find it somewhere else, because there is a real problem with persistent herbicides that are used to keep weeds out of hay and fields and things like that. And it shows up in feed for horses, it shows up in hay. So you spray it on your hay field, makes all the weeds go away. But these chemicals are so pervasive, these persistent herbicides, that they will survive being cut and baled. They'll survive the horse eating it and pooping it out, and in some cases they'll even survive the compost process. So responsible facilities will be doing seed germination tests or chemical testing to make sure that that's not in the product. And there's a lot of really sad stories about manure-based compost that people bought and then had just disasters in their garden with those persistent herbicides killing their tomatoes and other plants. So you want to ask people, what'd you feed your horses? Should I be at all worried about persistent herbicides? Make sure you get a really good answer. Otherwise, there's lots of other compost out there. Find it somewhere else. Now, if we're talking about composting horse manure, it's a great product or a great item to compost. So this is what I first started composting when I made my first piles as a commercial composter, was manure and bedding. So the great thing about it is the carbon to nitrogen ratio is ready to go. The biggest challenges you're going to have when we're composting manure is we want to make sure we get our moisture content right. Horse manure and bedding tends to be pretty dry, and when things get really dry, they can get hygroscopic, and they're really hard to rehydrate. So as you have horse manure and you're starting to build a compost pile, you want to be wetting it down, and you want to be wetting it down frequently as you're building the pile, because it's really hard to build a big pile and then dump a bunch of water. The water will not uniformly infiltrate. You'll get these dry pockets that won't decompose. So if you're taking horse manure and bedding to compost, make sure the moisture content is 50 to 60%. You'd want to be able to squeeze this and have a couple drips of water come out of your hand. That's when you know you're right. Understand that there are different beddings out there. Horse manure that's mixed with straw, that bedding's gonna disappear the first time through most likely. If you have things like pellets and shavings, they will still be in there. I would not worry about that carbon in your garden. Sometimes you'll see people write, oh, there was a lot of carbon in there and it robbed the nutrients from my garden. I think you'll be all right. The biggest challenge is that sometimes it looks really lumpy, right? So if you have horse manure that was done with sawdust and things like that, you end up with kind of a lumpy compost. But if you don't care about the appearance of it, I'd say you'd be good to go no matter what the bedding is. We also want to, like I said, make sure that we compost it so it gets hot. We want to make sure that pile gets 131 degrees and above so those weed seeds are gone. Make sure any manure that you source for composting isn't a risk for herbicides like we talked about, because you don't want to have that problem after all that hard work of composting it end up in your garden. And then the greatest things that would be cons, like I said, is just the hydration can be a really big challenge. But if you can make it yourself and you can compost that horse manure, it ends up being a really nice product. It ends up having really good kind of fluffy tilth to it as a compost and great organic matter. So if you can make it, your garden will be very, very happy. So there you go. Like, we're watching out for herbicides. If we're composting it, we're watching our moisture content. If we're buying it, we want to make sure it was done professionally, or if it was a farmer, they were doing it responsibly and they had a method and some temperature readings. And overall, don't put raw manure in your garden. It's not worth it. You want to use stable, finished compost or soil products in your garden. So there you go. That's all about horse manure. If you have questions, comments, concerns, want to know more, or things we didn't cover, please let us know in the comments. We do monitor it and we will help you out. So there you go. That's about horse manure. If you need more information on manure, let us know. I'm Justin with Veteran Compost, and happy composting.